Suddenly, my husband changed, and the shift was so abrupt that it felt like the air inside our home had been rearranged overnight. The man who once barely noticed when I left the room now followed me with worried eyes, asking if I felt dizzy, if the nausea was worse, if I needed water, if I wanted to lie down. His voice softened in ways I hadn't heard in years, gentle and almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced sounding concerned. Every movement of his carried intention, every question felt carefully placed. And yet, in my vulnerable state, weakened by relentless morning sickness, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this sudden attentiveness meant something good, something hopeful, something like love rediscovered. For weeks, my mornings had begun the same way, retching over the sink, my hands gripping the porcelain as my body betrayed me again and again. The pregnancy had drained me, not just physically but emotionally, stripping me of strength, clarity, and certainty. I was tired all the time, tired in ways sleep could not fix. So when he woke up before me that morning, moving quietly around the kitchen instead of turning his back and leaving for work, it startled me. The clatter of pans and the scent of warm bread pulled me out of bed. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. When I entered the kitchen, he turned around with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was standing over the stove, apron tied around his waist, sleeves rolled up like a man determined to play the role he had chosen. He greeted me with a tenderness that felt foreign. He guided me to the table, pulled out the chair, and insisted I sit. His hands lingered on my shoulders just a second too long. "You've been suffering," he said softly. "I wanted to do something nice for you." I searched his face for familiarity, for something that felt real, but all I could see was effort. Still, I was too exhausted to question it. Hope is a fragile thing, especially when you're desperate for it. I let myself imagine that maybe the baby had changed him. Maybe the responsibility had finally reached him. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. He placed the plate in front of me like an offering. The breakfast was elaborate, foods he had never bothered to learn before, arranged carefully, as if presentation itself could prove sincerity. He told me it was made especially to help with nausea, that he had read about it, that he cared. Each word landed gently, but something beneath them felt heavy, like a shadow passing over a bright surface. As I stared at the food, my stomach twisted, not just from sickness, but from an unexplainable discomfort that settled deep in my chest. The smell, though pleasant, suddenly felt overwhelming. My throat tightened, and the familiar wave of nausea surged again. I pushed the plate slightly away, embarrassed, apologetic, afraid of disappointing him after all this effort. He leaned forward instantly, concern flickering across his face, asking if I was okay, if I wanted to try just one bite. I shook my head, pressing a hand to my mouth. The room seemed to spin. I told him I couldn't eat, that the sickness was too strong that morning. For a brief second, something sharp crossed his expression. Too fast to fully register, too quick to accuse. But it was there. Then it vanished, replaced by that careful smile once more. He nodded, understanding, even sympathetic. "It's all right, he said. "I'll have someone else eat it. No point in wasting good food." I didn't think twice when I suggested giving it to his personal secretary. She was young, efficient, always nearby. In my mind, it was a practical solution, nothing more. The words left my mouth casually, without weight or suspicion. He paused just slightly, as if measuring something unseen, then agreed. He covered the plate, picked it up, and told me to rest. As he walked away, a strange chill brushed against my spine. I watched his back retreat down the hallway, apron still tied, breakfast still warm, intentions still hidden. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on hormones, exhaustion, anxiety. Pregnancy makes you sensitive, they say. Pregnancy makes you imagine things. So I lay down, closing my eyes, trying to quiet my thoughts. But even as I rested, my mind replayed the morning again and again. His sudden attentiveness, the rehearsed concern, the way his eyes never fully softened, the care that felt heavy instead of comforting. I remembered all the mornings before this one, the silence, the distance, the way he never once asked how I felt when I was sick. Why now? Why so suddenly? The questions lingered, unanswered, unsettling. Lying there, fighting waves of nausea, I told myself I was being unfair. People can change. Men can wake up one day and decide to do better. Miracles happen in quiet kitchens, don't they? Still, a part of me stayed alert, listening for sounds from the house, listening for something to go wrong, even though I didn't know what that something might be. In that moment, I had no idea that this simple morning, the breakfast, the concern, the small act of kindness, was not a turning point toward healing, but the opening note of a much darker truth. I didn't know that my weakness had made me vulnerable, or that my sickness had unknowingly protected me. All I knew was that my husband had never been this attentive before, and sometimes the most dangerous changes arrive wrapped in care, smiling gently, asking you to sit down and eat. He prepared the breakfast with his own hands, and that alone should have warned me that something was wrong. In all the years of our marriage, the kitchen had never been his territory. It was a place he passed through without seeing, a space where my labor was invisible and expected. Yet that morning, he moved through it with purpose, as if he had memorized every step. The counter was clean, the stove already warm, ingredients laid out carefully like pieces of a plan coming together. I watched him from the doorway, leaning against the frame because my legs felt weak. He cracked eggs slowly, deliberately, his movements steady and controlled. There was no rush in him, no impatience, none of the irritation he usually showed when things took time. He measured, stirred, tasted. He even adjusted the seasoning, muttering softly to himself as though he truly cared about getting it right. The smell filled the room, rich, comforting, almost nostalgic, and for a fleeting second, I felt transported to a version of our marriage that had never really existed. He told me he had researched foods that help with morning sickness, said he had stayed up late reading about it. The words sounded thoughtful, considerate, almost romantic. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at how unreal it felt, but instead my eyes burned with unexpected tears. When you are starved of care for so long, even a performance can feel like nourishment. I told myself not to question it. I told myself to accept the kindness while it lasted. He placed everything on a tray as if he were serving a guest of honor rather than his wife. The plate was arranged neatly, almost artistically. He wiped the edges clean, adjusted the napkin, poured a drink, and set it down gently so it wouldn't spill. Each detail felt intentional, excessive even. I noticed how he kept glancing at me, not with warmth, but with anticipation, as though my reaction mattered more than my comfort. When he finally carried the tray to the table, he pulled out the chair for me. The gesture felt ceremonial, like a scene borrowed from another life. "Eat slowly," he said, his voice low and soothing. "This will help. You need strength." He spoke like a man who knew exactly what he was doing, like someone following instructions rather than intuition. I picked up the fork, but my hand trembled, the nausea swelled again, sudden and merciless. My body rejected the idea of food entirely. The closer I brought the fork to my mouth, the tighter my throat became. I set it back down, embarrassed, ashamed of my own weakness. I apologized instinctively, the way women do when their bodies fail to cooperate. He leaned forward immediately, concern sharpening his features. He asked if the smell was too strong, if the portion was too much, if he should make something else. His questions came too quickly, stacked one on top of another. It felt less like care and more like pressure. Still, his tone remained gentle, practiced. He smiled again, reassuring me that it was fine, that I didn't have to force myself. As I stared at the untouched food, a strange thought crossed my mind. Why was this so important to him? Why did it matter so much that I eat this particular breakfast? The question flickered briefly before I pushed it away. Suspicion felt like an insult to effort, and I wasn't ready to accuse him of anything, even in my thoughts. He suggested I rest, said my health was more important than a meal. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that the food shouldn't go to waste. His voice was light, but his eyes were sharp, calculating something I couldn't see. I told him he could give it to anyone at work, maybe his secretary, since she was always rushing and rarely had time to eat properly. There was a pause, small, almost invisible, but I felt it. The air seemed to hold its breath. He looked at the plate, then back at me, then nodded slowly. "That's a good idea," he said. His smile returned, wider now, more relaxed, as if a decision had just been confirmed. He covered the tray carefully, as though protecting it, preserving something delicate. Watching him carry it away, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach that had nothing to do with sickness. The breakfast he had prepared with such devotion suddenly felt heavy with meaning, like an object that had absorbed intention and secrecy. Left alone at the table, I replayed the scene in my head, the effort, the insistence, the way his mood shifted the moment I refused to eat. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe he just wanted to feel useful. Maybe this was his way of coping with the pregnancy. Maybe I was overthinking, letting hormones turn kindness into suspicion. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. That breakfast wasn't just food. It was a message, a test, a move in a game I didn't yet understand. I realized how little I truly knew about the man I shared my life with, how easily he could step into a role and play it convincingly. As I went to lie down, the smell of the food still clinging to the air, I felt an inexplicable sense of relief that I hadn't eaten it. At the same time, guilt crept in, whispering that I was being ungrateful, dramatic, unfair. I told myself to sleep, to rest, to trust my husband. I didn't know then that this carefully prepared breakfast was never about nourishment or love. I didn't know that every ingredient, every gesture, every smile had been placed with intention. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, he had done something extraordinary, and sometimes the most extraordinary efforts hide the darkest motives. It was my idea to give the breakfast to his personal secretary, and that truth haunted me long before I understood why. At the time, it felt harmless, even considerate. I was too sick to eat, the food was freshly made, and she was always nearby, always busy, always forgotten. It seemed like the kind of small decision that carried no weight. I didn't know then how some choices, spoken casually and without thought, can become turning points you can never walk back from. When I mentioned her name, I did it without emotion. I wasn't thinking about her as a person, only as a solution. He listened quietly, his face unreadable, his hand still resting near the covered plate. For a brief moment, I thought he might refuse, that he might suggest someone else or simply throw the food away. Instead, he agreed too quickly. His acceptance felt smooth, effortless, as though it aligned perfectly with something already formed in his mind. He lifted the tray with care, adjusting the cover to make sure nothing spilled, nothing shifted. The way he handled it was almost reverent, as if it were fragile, important. I remember noticing how steady his hands were. There was no hesitation in him, no confusion, no disappointment. If anything, he seemed relieved. That detail stayed with me, settling quietly in the back of my thoughts. As he walked out, he told me to rest and closed the door softly behind him. The house fell silent, but my mind did not. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. The nausea came and went in waves, but beneath it, something else stirred. An unease I couldn't name, a tension that refused to loosen. I tried to distract myself by thinking of ordinary things. The laundry I hadn't folded, the emails I needed to answer, the doctor's appointment later that week. But my thoughts kept circling back to the breakfast, to the way he had looked at it, to the way he had looked at me when I said I couldn't eat. I wondered why I felt the need to justify myself, even in my own mind. An hour passed slowly. Time stretched, sticky, and uncomfortable. I drifted in and out of shallow rest, never fully asleep. Each small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, a distant car passing outside, pulled me back to awareness. My body was exhausted, but my instincts were wide awake. I thought about his secretary then, more clearly than before. She was efficient, polite, always dressed neatly, always careful not to overstep. She knew her place in his world, just as I knew mine. There had never been jealousy on my part, only a vague awareness of her presence, like a piece of office furniture that moved and spoke when necessary. I told myself she would enjoy the breakfast, that she would probably be grateful. Still, an image formed in my mind, her sitting at her desk, lifting the cover, smelling the food. The thought made my stomach turn again. I shifted onto my side, pressing a pillow against my abdomen, trying to calm myself. I whispered that I was being ridiculous, that pregnancy hormones were turning everything dramatic and strange. The phone rang. The sound sliced through the quiet, sharp and sudden. I flinched, my heart jumping into my throat. For a moment, I stared at the phone as if it were something alive, something dangerous. It rang again before I forced myself to answer. There was shouting on the other end, voices overlapping, panicked, confused. I recognized my husband's voice beneath the noise, strained and urgent. He was asking questions too quickly, demanding answers that weren't coming fast enough. Then I heard another sound, distant but unmistakable, a scream, high, raw, filled with terror. My blood ran cold. The call ended abruptly. I sat there, frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. My hands began to shake, not violently, but enough that I noticed. My mind struggled to make sense of what I had heard. A scream at his office, panic, chaos, and underneath it all, the image of the covered breakfast tray burned itself into my thoughts. I tried calling him back. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. Each unanswered ring tightened the knot in my chest. My breathing grew shallow, my thoughts racing ahead of themselves, leaping to conclusions I wasn't ready to face. I remembered the way he had insisted I eat, the way his expression had flickered when I refused, the way he had agreed so easily to give the food away. Pieces that hadn't fit before began shifting, aligning into something darker, heavier. Guilt crept in quietly, insidiously. What if she was sick because of the food? What if my casual suggestion had put her in danger? The idea made me feel dizzy. I pressed my forehead into the mattress, fighting the urge to vomit, fighting the urge to cry. Minutes passed like hours. I imagined ambulances, flashing lights, people gathering, whispering. I imagined her face pale with fear, her body betraying her the way mine had betrayed me all morning. The parallel made my chest ache. I told myself to wait, to breathe, to trust that this was a misunderstanding, an unrelated emergency. But deep down, a truth was beginning to surface, one I wasn't ready to name. Sometimes danger announces itself softly first, disguised as kindness, hidden inside everyday decisions. As I lay there, helpless and shaking, I realized that giving away that breakfast had not removed me from the story. It had placed me directly inside it, and whatever had just happened, whatever that scream meant, my life was no longer following a path I recognized. Barely an hour later, the scream tore through the calm of an ordinary morning, violent enough to fracture reality itself. It wasn't the kind of scream that comes from surprise or irritation. It was raw, instinctive, pulled from the deepest place where fear lives. The sound traveled through walls, hallways, phones, and hearts, carrying with it a warning no one could misunderstand. Something had gone terribly wrong. I wasn't there to witness it, but I would come to know that scream intimately. It would replay in my mind again and again, sharper each time, filling the spaces between my thoughts. In that moment, as chaos erupted at his office, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart pounded violently, my skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. Even without seeing it, I felt it. At the office, people froze mid-step. Conversations died in unfinished sentences. Chairs scraped against the floor as employees rushed toward the sound. Papers fluttered down, forgotten. Someone shouted her name, another person yelled for help. Panic spread quickly, contagious and unstoppable, turning a familiar workplace into a scene of confusion and fear. She was found near her desk, the breakfast container overturned beside her. The smell that had once felt comforting now hung heavy in the air, sickeningly sweet. Her face had drained of color, lips trembling, eyes wide with terror she couldn't put into words. Her hands clawed weakly at her throat as her body betrayed her, reacting violently to something inside it. Someone tried to steady her, another person backed away in shock. No one knew what to do first. Questions flew wildly. Was it an allergy, food poisoning? Had she fainted? Each guess only deepened the panic. The scream had drawn everyone in, but no one was prepared for what they were seeing. My husband arrived moments later. He pushed through the crowd with urgency that bordered on desperation. When he saw her, something flickered across his face, something fast and unreadable. It wasn't shock, it wasn't concern, it was recognition. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting briefly to the spilled food before returning to her convulsing form. He knelt beside her, calling her name, telling her to breathe, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. To an outsider, it might have sounded like care, but those who were close enough noticed his hands shaking, not with fear for her, but with something closer to panic. The mask he wore so carefully that morning threatened to slip. Someone had already called emergency services. The minutes that followed stretched endlessly, each second thick with dread. She gasped, her breathing shallow and uneven, her body fighting an invisible enemy. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to speak, but no words came, only broken sounds and terrified whimpers. Whispers began almost immediately. People glanced at the breakfast container, at the way it lay open on the floor. Someone murmured that it had been brought from home. Another person said it was meant for someone else. The story began forming in fragments, pieced together by fear and curiosity. When the sirens finally arrived, their sound cut through the office like a blade. Paramedics rushed in, efficient and calm, pushing aside onlookers. They asked questions quickly, their voices steady against the storm of speculation. What had she eaten? When had the symptoms started? Did she have any known conditions? My husband answered too quickly. He knew details he shouldn't have needed to recall so fast. He spoke with certainty, his words clipped, controlled. One of the paramedics looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, eyes narrowing slightly, as if something didn't quite add up. They lifted her onto a stretcher, securing straps around her trembling body. As they wheeled her away, her eyes searched the room wildly, landing briefly on my husband. There was something in that look, fear, confusion, maybe even accusation, that followed him long after she was gone. The office was left in stunned silence. The floor was marked where the food had spilled, where her body had collapsed. Someone opened a window, desperate for fresh air. Others stood in small clusters, whispering, replaying the scene, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. News traveled fast. By the time I heard, the scream had already transformed into rumor, speculation, half-truths, but no version softened its impact. My hands shook as I tried to piece together what had happened from broken messages and hurried explanations. I sat alone, my body heavy, my mind racing. The morning replayed itself relentlessly. The breakfast, his insistence, his smile, the way he'd carried the tray away. Each memory felt sharper now, edged with meaning. The scream filled the spaces between those memories, stitching them together into something horrifyingly clear. Guilt wrapped itself around me like a tightening rope. If I hadn't suggested giving the food away, if I had forced myself to eat, if I had questioned him instead of trusting the performance, the weight of those thoughts pressed down until it was hard to breathe. But beneath the guilt, another realization began to surface, slow and terrible. That scream wasn't just a reaction to pain, it was a revelation. It was the sound of a truth breaking free, tearing through carefully constructed lies. As sirens faded into the distance and the office tried to return to normal, nothing truly settled. Something had been unleashed that couldn't be undone, and even though I wasn't there to hear it in person, that scream marked the moment everything changed, the moment the darkness we had been skirting finally stepped into the light. The truth did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, through cracks no one noticed at first, spreading quietly until it touched everything. In the hours after the scream, the world tried to pretend that order could be restored, that a workplace could return to routine, that a marriage could continue as before. But truth has a way of pressing forward, even when it is unwelcome, even when everyone involved would rather look away. At the hospital, doctors spoke in careful tones, choosing words that carried distance and control. They asked about what she had eaten when she had eaten it, who had prepared it. Each question peeled back another layer of the morning, exposing details that had once seemed harmless. The answers were written down, repeated, compared. Nothing felt casual anymore. My husband was there, hovering just outside the curtain, his concern carefully displayed. He asked the doctors for updates too often, offered information before it was requested, corrected small details that no one else would have noticed. To those watching, it might have looked like dedication. To me, as I replayed it all in my head later, it felt like management, of facts, of perception, of risk. The secretary survived, but her condition was serious enough to invite scrutiny. Tests were ordered. Samples were taken. The food became evidence. The breakfast container, once ordinary, was sealed and labeled, transformed into something dangerous simply by being examined closely. What had been meant to nourish now demanded explanation. Whispers grew louder. Someone remembered how the food had been brought from home. Someone else recalled hearing that it was originally meant for me. That detail spread quickly, passing from mouth to mouth, gaining weight with each repetition. The story shifted, bending toward a center no one wanted to face. When my husband came home that evening, the house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had moved closer together. He spoke calmly, too calmly, explaining that there had been an incident at work, that his secretary had fallen ill unexpectedly. He avoided details unless pressed, framing everything as unfortunate coincidence. I listened, nodding, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I asked him what the doctors had said. He hesitated for half a second too long. Then he told me they were still investigating, that it was probably an allergic reaction or contamination. His voice carried reassurance, but his eyes betrayed him. They moved constantly, never settling, scanning for threats that weren't there. That night, sleep refused to come. Every sound felt amplified. The house creaked inside around us, filled with things unsaid. I lay awake beside him, feeling the heat of his body, wondering how someone so close could feel so distant, so unfamiliar. My mind replayed every interaction, every glance, every word spoken that morning. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened, quietly at first, then with increasing focus. Questions were asked again, this time more precisely: who had access to the food, who had prepared it. Why had it been redirected? The answers pointed in one direction, narrowing steadily. I noticed changes in him. His patience thinned. His attentiveness turned sharp, watchful. He asked where I went, who I spoke to, what I had heard. His kindness returned in bursts, intense and unsettling, as if affection itself could distract from what was unfolding. Guilt and fear tangled inside me. Part of me wanted to protect him, to cling to the version of him I had believed in for so long. Another part, quieter but growing stronger, began to understand that protection might cost me everything. I remembered the way he had insisted I eat, the urgency beneath the care, the way relief had crossed his face when I refused. The truth revealed itself not through confession, but through accumulation, a report here, a comment there, a look exchanged between professionals who had seen this kind of thing before. Patterns emerged, undeniable and terrifying. The breakfast had not been an act of love. It had been a calculation. One afternoon, a doctor asked me directly whether I had eaten any of the food. The question landed heavily, reshaping the air between us. When I said no, I felt something shift irrevocably. The implication hung there, unspoken but clear. After that, nothing could return to the way it was. Every interaction with my husband felt layered, charged with meaning. His words seemed scripted. His gestures felt deliberate. I began to see how carefully he had constructed his world, how easily he moved pieces into place. The truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was present, pressing against every moment, demanding to be acknowledged. And as it came into focus, I realized something even more devastating than betrayal. The danger had never been accidental. It had been planned, measured, and only narrowly diverted. The morning sickness I had cursed became something else entirely. Not a weakness, but a barrier. Not an inconvenience, but a warning. The truth had surfaced slowly and relentlessly, and with it came the understanding that the man I had trusted was capable of far more than I had ever imagined. The realization did not strike like lightning. It settled in slowly, heavy and suffocating, until it became impossible to breathe around it. At first, it was just a thought I refused to finish, a sentence my mind kept breaking apart before it reached its end. The breakfast was never meant for her. Each time the idea surfaced, I pushed it away, ashamed of where it led, terrified of what it implied. I tried to hold on to smaller explanations. Mistakes happen. Accidents occur. Food can spoil. People can react unpredictably. But every explanation collapsed under the weight of what I already knew. He had never cooked for me before. He had never shown that kind of concern. He had never insisted so urgently on anything related to my well-being. And yet, that morning, everything had been precise, controlled, deliberate. The more I revisited the details, the clearer the pattern became. The way he woke up early, the way he stayed close watching me carefully, the way his eyes searched my face as I looked at the plate, waiting for a reaction. He hadn't been hoping I would feel better. He had been waiting to see whether I would eat. That truth hollowed something out inside me. I remembered how relieved he looked when I pushed the plate away. At the time, I thought it was understanding, empathy, concern for my discomfort. Now I saw it for what it was: adjustment, a calculation changing course, a plan bending, not breaking. When the secretary fell ill, people assumed she had been the target. It was easier to believe that. Safer, the narrative protected everyone involved from facing something far worse. But the timeline told a different story. The food had been prepared in my kitchen, for my body, meant to be consumed in my home. She had only become part of it because I refused. That knowledge crept into my thoughts during the quietest moments, while washing my hands, while brushing my teeth, while staring at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. I felt exposed, as if danger had brushed past my skin without leaving a mark. I began to notice things I had ignored for years. His need for control, his subtle anger when things didn't go his way, the way disagreements always ended with me apologizing, even when I didn't know what for. The way he preferred outcomes, not conversations, compliance, not connection. The pregnancy had complicated everything. It had made me slower, weaker, more dependent. Vulnerability had entered the space between us, and instead of protecting it, he had measured it. I wondered how long he had been waiting, whether the plan had formed suddenly or whether it had been sitting quietly, gathering patience. I watched him closely after that, listening to the spaces between his words. His affection came in calculated bursts, flowers, gentle touches, concerned questions, always timed, always deliberate. It was as if he believed kindness could overwrite suspicion, that tenderness could erase intent. At night, I lay awake beside him, my body tense, my senses alert. I listened to his breathing, even and calm, and wondered how someone could sleep so peacefully beside a person they had nearly harmed. The thought made my skin crawl. I stopped sharing things with him. Small details, private thoughts, physical discomforts. I guarded myself instinctively, even before I consciously understood why. Trust had drained away, replaced by something colder and sharper. The most terrifying part wasn't that he might have wanted me gone. It was that he had smiled while preparing for it, that he had wrapped danger in care, poison in concern, that he had stood so close to me, guiding me to a chair, asking me to eat, believing I wouldn't question it. I realized then how easily love can be weaponized, how familiarity can become access, how the person who knows your routines best also knows exactly how to exploit them. The secretary's survival was called luck. My refusal to eat was blamed on morning sickness, but I knew better. Luck doesn't explain precision, sickness doesn't explain relief, and coincidence doesn't explain intent. I carried that understanding quietly, like a fragile but dangerous object inside me. I couldn't speak it yet. I couldn't accuse him, but I could no longer pretend. The breakfast was never meant for her. It had been prepared for me, served with a smile, offered as care. And I survived not because he changed his mind, but because my body rejected what my heart had trusted. From that moment on, nothing about my marriage felt accidental. Everything had edges, everything had weight, and I understood with devastating clarity that the danger I feared outside had been living beside me all along. Survival did not arrive as relief. It arrived as clarity, sharp and unforgiving. Once the truth settled inside me, there was no comfort in knowing I had lived. Living meant remembering. Living meant carrying the weight of what almost happened and understanding that escape had been accidental, not granted. I moved through my days differently after that, quieter, more deliberate, as though any sudden motion might disturb something still watching. I began to understand that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it forms silently, in the space where fear has nowhere left to hide. I stopped waiting for him to change. I stopped hoping for apologies or explanations. Hope, I realized, had been my greatest vulnerability. It had kept me still when I should have been moving. Every morning I woke before him. I listened to the house while it slept, memorizing its sounds, its rhythms. I paid attention to things I had once ignored. The way doors closed, the way footsteps echoed, the way silence could stretch too long. Awareness became my armor. I smiled when necessary. I answered politely. I played the role he expected, not because I believed in it, but because I understood the danger of disrupting his illusion. There was power in appearing unaware. There was safety in being underestimated. Inside, something else was growing, a resolve I did not speak aloud. I began documenting small details in my mind, storing them carefully. Times, words, reactions, patterns. I learned to separate emotion from observation, fear from strategy. Pregnancy had made me vulnerable, but it had also sharpened me. I became fiercely protective, not only of the life growing inside me, but of my own. I spoke to my body differently now, with gratitude instead of frustration. The sickness that had once weakened me had become my warning system. I reached out quietly, cautiously, a doctor, a trusted acquaintance, conversations framed as hypotheticals, questions asked without accusation. I learned what options existed without revealing my hand. Knowledge replaced panic, one careful step at a time. At night, when he slept beside me, I no longer mistook proximity for intimacy. I saw it for what it was: access. I guarded my thoughts carefully, keeping my breathing steady, my presence unremarkable. He believed the crisis had passed. He believed control had been restored. But I was changing. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had almost been destroyed. I began seeing myself as someone who had survived an attempted erasure. That shift mattered. It changed the way I stood, the way I spoke, the way I made decisions. Fear did not disappear. It became focused. Directed, useful, I allowed it to inform me, not paralyze me. Each instinct I had once dismissed now became something I listened to closely. I no longer wondered why he had done it. That question belonged to a version of me that still believed understanding could heal everything. Now, I understood that some truths are not meant to be processed emotionally, only acted upon wisely. The world continued as if nothing had happened. People laughed, work resumed, time moved forward. But beneath that normalcy, a line had been crossed, and I stood firmly on the other side of it. I learned that survival is not passive, it is intentional. It is the quiet refusal to be harmed again. It is choosing oneself without announcing it. I no longer needed validation, confession, or closure. I needed distance, safety, control over my own future, the woman I had been that morning, the one who searched his face for sincerity, who apologized for being sick, who trusted care without question, no longer existed. In her place stood someone alert, grounded, and awake. I carried no illusions now, only awareness, and awareness, once earned, cannot be taken away. Whatever came next, I would meet it prepared, not because I was fearless, but because I had already faced the most dangerous truth of all, that the threat had been closest when I felt safest.